At 4:17 in the morning, my phone rang. I did not move right away. I was already awake. The way old men often are at that hour, sitting in a dark kitchen. Not quite sleeping. Not quite present. Just filling a chair with whatever is left of yourself after the people you loved most have gone. There was a cup of decaf on the table in front of me, cooling the way it always did because I kept forgetting to drink it. Outside, Vermont was buried under February snow. The kind of snow that muffles everything and makes the world feel sealed shut. Like a letter no one will ever open. The phone rang again. Phones do not ring at 4 in the morning with good news. I knew that. My wife Margaret had known that too. She used to say that any call after midnight was either a wrong number or a life-changing event. And experience had taught us there was rarely any in between. So I sat there and let it ring a third time. Maybe I was hoping whoever it was would give up. Maybe some part of me already understood. In that way that the body sometimes understands things before the mind is ready. That once I answered, I could not go back to the life I had been quietly living. Finally, I picked it up. I said hello. For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end. The kind of careful, controlled breathing that sounds less like calm and more like someone trying very hard not to come apart. Then a young voice whispered one word. Granddad. I went completely still. That word had no right to exist in my life. My wife Margaret had been gone for 11 years. My only son, Wesley, had died 6 years earlier on a logging road outside Burlington in February. The police called it black ice, a closed casket, a brief service attended by people I barely knew, a folded flag of silence draped over the rest of my life. Wesley had never married. He had never told me about a child. As far as I had known for 6 years, my family had ended with him in that ravine. So when that frightened voice came through the receiver, I did what any 68-year-old man sitting alone in the dark would do. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached and I said, "Who is this?" There was a pause. Behind him, I could hear wind sharp and open. Not the soft wind that brushes past a window, but the kind that cuts through thin clothing and finds skin. He was standing somewhere outside, somewhere with no walls. "My name is Cooper," he said. "I'm Wesley's son. I know you don't know me. I know how this sounds, but I need help." I did not answer. I did not breathe. I held the phone and felt 6 years of grief shift inside me, like furniture moving in a dark room. Then he said, "They're going to find me." Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside, everything I had buried with my son began clawing its way back toward the surface. For a few seconds, I genuinely believed he had the wrong number. Not because his voice sounded dishonest. It did not. There was too much real fear in it for that. Practiced fear sounds different, tighter, more controlled. What I heard in his voice was the kind of fear that slips past every wall a person builds. The kind that makes a 16-year-old boy call a stranger at 4 in the morning because there is no one left. But the thing he was saying was impossible. Wesley was my only child. I had been at his birth, his first day of school, the college graduation he never quite finished, the Christmas dinners that got quieter as the years went on. When they pulled his truck from that ravine, I identified what was left. There was no wife, no girlfriend anyone knew about, no unfinished family waiting somewhere out in the world. I had repeated that to myself so many times it had become a kind of prayer. Wesley was gone. Margaret was gone. I was the last Aldworth. So I gripped the phone harder and said, "Son, I think you have the wrong number." The boy did not argue. He did not panic. He took one careful breath. And then he said my full name. Then he said my wife's name. Then he said Wesley's. The dead, quiet kitchen suddenly felt very crowded. He kept going. "Your wife died of a stroke in October of 2014. He said. "Your son drove a green Ford F-250. He had a scar over his left eyebrow from falling off a horse when he was 9 years old. That was when my knees went weak. No scammer knows that. No random frightened boy at a payphone in the middle of a Vermont winter could have guessed it. The scar was not in any obituary. The truck had never been listed in any article. Margaret's stroke was not the kind of story that made news anywhere beyond the small circle of people who had loved her. These were private pieces of a private life. I have a picture of him, Cooper said. His voice was shaking now. Just slightly. The way a person shakes when they have been cold for too long and their body is starting to lose the argument with the temperature. I have his watch. I have letters he wrote to my mother before he died. She kept them for 16 years. She saved everything. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. Because with every sentence, the impossible became something else. And the family I believed had ended was reaching through the phone, cold and terrified, asking me to answer. Where are you? I finally managed. There was a sound on his end like he had turned his face away from the wind. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. A payphone, he said. I think it might be the last one in this state. I had to walk 8 miles to get to it. 8 miles. In Vermont. In February. In the dark. In the middle of the night. I looked out the kitchen window at the snow piling against the glass and felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with logic or proof or the sensible caution of a 68-year-old man who had already lost too much. I stopped thinking about whether he was telling the truth. I started thinking about how cold he must be. I can't go back, he said. There are people looking for me. My mom died 3 weeks ago. I don't have anywhere else to go. Then his voice broke on the next word in a way I do not think he planned. He said, please. And then, one more time. That word. Granddad. It landed in my chest like a hand reaching through 6 years of closed doors. Finding what was left of me. And pulling it back towards something. I did not make a plan. I did not sit at that kitchen table and weigh the risks the way a sensible person would have done. I did not call anyone. I did not wait until morning. I simply said the strangest words I had spoken in 6 years. I said, tell me where you are. I'm coming to get you. He gave me an intersection near the Canadian border, a small town I had driven through perhaps twice in my life. The kind of place that exists on a map mostly as a reference point between larger places. I told him to stay by the payphone, keep his head down, and not speak to anyone. Then I hung up, sat for 30 seconds in the silence, and got dressed. I pulled on my coat, my boots, my gloves. Then I went to the hall closet and took down my father's shotgun. I want to be honest about that. I am not a brave man. I was a retired school principal with bad knees, a hearing aid, and hands that shook when I was scared. I had not fired that shotgun since 1987. I had no plan beyond driving north and finding the boy. But I put it in the trunk of my maroon Buick anyway. And then I backed out into the snow and drove toward a voice that had called me Granddad. The road north was worse than I had expected. The plows had not reached half the county yet. And in places, the snow climbed so high against the car that I could feel the tires fighting for every inch of ground. My headlights caught nothing but white in every direction. The windshield wipers beat back and forth with a rhythm that felt exactly like a nervous heartbeat. And in all that white silence, I thought about Wesley. I thought about the last Christmas before he died. He had come home from Pennsylvania quieter than usual. Thinner too, though I had told myself I was imagining it. After dinner, after the dishes were done and the house had gone still, he had sat across from me at this same kitchen table, turning a coffee mug between both hands. He had a way of doing that when something was on his mind, turning the mug, watching the table, not quite ready to speak. Then he said, Dad, if anything ever happens to me, I want you to know I love you, and I want you to know I tried. I asked him what he meant. He only looked down at the mug. I should have pushed. I should have asked again and again until he told me what was weighing on him. But I told myself he was tired. I told myself the mood would pass. I let the silence sit there between us like a guest neither of us wanted to address. 4 months later, My son was dead. And for 6 years, I had been living inside the version of events that required the least amount of courage to believe. I reached the intersection at a little after 5 in the morning. The sky was not quite morning yet. It was that bruised gray-purple color that comes just before sunrise, when the world looks like it has been holding its breath all night and has not yet decided to let it out. There was a closed gas station on one corner, its pumps buried under snow. Across from it stood a small wooden shelter with a payphone bolted to the wall. And standing under that shelter was a boy. He straightened when my headlights swept across him. At first, I saw only how thin he was. His jacket was the wrong weight for February, a light thing meant for fall. Not for this. His boots were too big. Probably not his. His shoulders were drawn in around himself from cold. Or fear. Or the particular combination of both that follows a person who has been running. Then he stepped toward the car and the gray pre-dawn light found his face. He had Wesley's jaw. Not identically. Not the way you see it in a photograph side by side and say yes. Obviously. Those are the same person. More like the way certain resemblances only reveal themselves to the people who knew the original well, the angle. The set of it. Something about the proportion that only meant anything to a father. Then he came closer. And the light caught his eyes. Pale gray. Deep set. Slightly lifted at the outer corners. Margaret's eyes. I had loved those eyes across a dinner table for over 30 years. I had watched them close for the last time in a hospital room 11 years earlier. And now they were looking at me from the face of a 16-year-old boy standing in the snow outside a payphone at 5 in the morning. Waiting to see if I would drive away. I could not move for a moment. I could not even lower the window. The boy looked at me the way people look at someone who is their last remaining option. "Granddad," he said again. And I said, "Get in the car. Son, get in right now." Once we were moving south, the heat beginning to pull color back into his face. I asked him the question I had been dreading since the moment I left the house. "Who was your mother?" He kept his eyes on the road in front of us for a long moment. "Her name was Caitlin Brennan," he said. "She grew up near Scranton, Pennsylvania." The name meant nothing to me. I had never heard Wesley mention it. He told me the rest of it in pieces. The way you tell a story when you are not entirely sure how much the other person can handle at once. His mother had met Wesley years earlier. When my son was working a road construction job in Pennsylvania after leaving college, they were together for almost a year. Long enough for something real to develop. Long enough for her to become pregnant. Long enough for the wrong people to find out about it. She said he was the only genuinely good person she had ever known. Cooper told me. She said he was kind in a way that surprised her. She said he made her feel like she could become someone different from who she had always been told she was. I held the wheel tighter. "Why didn't she tell him about you?" Cooper swallowed. "Her father," he said. "Because of what her family was." When Marcus Brennan found out his daughter was pregnant with the child of a man he had not approved of, he gave her a choice that was never really a choice at all. End the pregnancy. Or disappear with the child and make sure my son never knew he existed. She chose to run. For 15 years, Caitlin raised Cooper under a name that was not hers. In a small town where nobody asked too many questions, she worked as a waitress. She moved carefully. She taught her son to stay quiet and keep his head down and never trust a man who smiled too easily. She built a life out of caution and distance and love. And for a while, it held. But somehow, Wesley found out. Cooper did not know how. Caitlin had never told him the full story. Maybe my son saw an old photograph. Maybe a letter found its way into the wrong hands. Maybe love has a particular way of pulling truth out of the places where fear tries to bury it. All Cooper knew was that in the spring before my son died, Wesley had made contact with his mother. He had started sending money. He had written letters. He had told Caitlin he wanted to meet his son. He wanted to bring them somewhere safe. He had, in whatever way he could manage, decided to be a father. And 4 months after he made that decision, his truck went off a logging road in a February storm outside Burlington. My mom said it wasn't an accident, Cooper said it quietly. Just those 6 words. Dropped into the warmth of the car like something too heavy to carry further. I kept both hands on the wheel. I kept my eyes on the road. I did not say anything. She said my father was killed because he found us. Cooper continued. Because he wanted to bring us out of hiding. Because the wrong people understood what that would mean for them. The road ahead blurred for a moment and I had to blink hard to keep driving. 6 years. For 6 years. I had repeated the official version until it had become indistinguishable from memory. Black ice. Bad road. Wrong curve in the dark. A tragic accident on a lonely stretch of highway. That was what the state troopers had told me. That was what the report said. That was what I had needed to believe. Because the alternative that someone had looked at my son and decided he needed to stop existing would have destroyed something in me that I was not sure I could afford to lose. My grandfather told my mom after Wesley died that it was a warning. Cooper said. He told her if she ever talked to anyone, if she ever went to the police, if she ever let my father's family know about me, the same thing would happen to me. A threat spoken over a fresh grave to a woman who had just lost the person she loved most. Delivered by her own father. I thought about Wesley turning that coffee mug between his hands at Christmas. Telling me he had tried. He had been trying to reach his child. Someone had made sure he never got there. What changed? I asked. Why did you run when you did? Cooper was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had that particular flatness that belongs to grief that is too new to have edges yet. My mom died 3 weeks ago, he said. Pancreatic cancer. It was fast. She knew for months, but she didn't tell me until near the end. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow against that. The last thing she told me, before she couldn't talk anymore, was that I had to find you. She said you were the only real family I had left. She said she should have contacted my father sooner. She said she spent 16 years being afraid of the wrong thing. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the kind of wrapping that tells you someone packed in a hurry and used whatever was at hand. She left me a box. He said, letters, pictures, your phone number, my father's watch. She said when I was ready, I could decide what to do with it. A dying woman had spent her last days pointing her son toward me, and I had almost let the phone ring. Cooper told me the rest of it as we drove. His mother's funeral had been small. A few people from the town they had lived in most recently. A couple of co-workers. The hospice nurse who had been kind to them both near the end. He had stood at the graveside in his good shirt and tried to remember how to breathe. Then Marcus Brennan had appeared. Cooper had seen him only a handful of times in his life. Caitlin had kept the distance between them deliberately and carefully. But there was no keeping it now. His mother's father arrived at the funeral home the day after she died, moving through the space like a man who owned it. He told Cooper it was time to come back to Pennsylvania. He told him he was family now, and family belonged together. He didn't say it like he was sad. Cooper told me, he said it like he was collecting something, like I was an item on a list that he had been waiting to check off. That night, Cooper packed the plastic-wrapped bundle his mother had left him and walked out into the cold. By the time anyone noticed, he was gone. He had already put a county between himself and the town. He had been running for 4 days before he found the payphone. By the time we pulled into my driveway, there was pale light at the edge of the sky. The first tentative gray of a winter morning. Cooper stood in my kitchen with snow still melting off his boots, holding that bundle against his chest with both arms, like it was the only thing he trusted to stay with him. I made eggs, toast, bacon, and coffee he did not touch. He ate like someone who had been hungry for longer than one morning, not fast, not careless, just with a kind of quiet desperation that makes you look away because watching it feels too private. When he was done, I took him upstairs to Wesley's old room. I had never changed it. Baseball trophies on the dresser, a pennant above the bed, books on the shelf that Wesley had always intended to read and never quite got to. It was a room that had been preserved not by plan but by the simple absence of any reason to disturb it. Cooper stood in the doorway. This was his room, he asked. Yes, I said. It's yours for now. He nodded once, lay down fully clothed on top of the covers, and was asleep within minutes. I closed the door and went back downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. There was a hunted boy asleep in my dead son's room. There were men somewhere looking for him. And somewhere in the bundle he had carried through 4 days of winter was the truth about what had happened to Wesley. I waited until I was sure Cooper was deeply asleep. Then I picked up the phone again. His name was Donald Pikeworth. I had taught him American history in 1991. When he was a sharp, restless kid who asked inconvenient questions and refused to accept the easy answer when the real one was still available. He became a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of New York. I had written his law school recommendation letter. I had attended his wedding, and then life had moved on the way it does. And we had not spoken in 8 years. He answered on the third ring. Groggy but immediate. Mr. Aldworth. They always still called me that. Donald. I said, I need you to listen all the way through before you say anything. And then I told him everything. The phone call. Cooper. Caitlin Brennan. The letters. The watch. The warning given over a fresh grave. Marcus Brennan. The name Eddie Doran. The warehouse on Route 6. The truck that went off a road in February 6 years ago and was called an accident by people who may have known better. When I finished, Donald was silent for long enough that I wondered if he had fallen back asleep. Then he said, Lock your doors. Don't take him anywhere. I'm coming tomorrow. Donald arrived the next afternoon with 2 people I had never met. One was a woman named Sarah Holcomb Forties. Dark coat. Quiet face. Leather folder. The kind of professional calm that you only develop after years of sitting across from frightened people and helping them find a way forward. Donald introduced her as FBI without elaboration. The other man never took off his jacket and never stood with his back to a window. I did not ask his name. I did not need to. Cooper sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea he was not drinking. In the daylight, he looked younger than he had at 5 in the morning in the snow. He looked like what he was, a 16-year-old boy who should have been worrying about college applications and weekend plans. Not sitting across from federal agents with his father's letters in a plastic bag beside him. Sarah spoke first. Cooper, we're not here to force you into anything. She said, we're here to listen. For almost 4 hours, they asked questions. Where had he lived? What towns? What names? What had Caitlin told him? When did Wesley first make contact? What did Marcus Brennan say at the funeral? Who was Eddie Doran? What warehouse on Route 6? What had he seen? What had he heard? What had his mother told him in those final weeks? Cooper answered everything. Sometimes his voice shook. Sometimes he stopped and stared at the table and I thought he could not go on. But each time, he looked at me, took a breath, and kept going. By the time the sun began to drop, my kitchen no longer felt like a home. It felt like the first room in a much longer story. That night, Cooper opened his mother's bundle on the kitchen table. There were photographs of Wesley I had never seen. My son smiling beside a truck. My son in a flannel shirt with paint on his hands. My son looking at the camera with a kind of unguarded happiness I had not known he was capable of during the years I had watched him quietly withdraw. There were 16 letters in Wesley's handwriting. I recognized the slant of it immediately, the same handwriting that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists and the single note he had left on my door one Christmas morning that said simply, "Thanks for everything, Dad." There was his watch, scratched across the face but still running faintly, like it had decided not to stop when he did. And there was Caitlin's note, written in the last weeks of her life, when her hands could barely hold a pen, every line shaky but deliberate. A dying woman who had spent 16 years running from the truth, using her last strength not to say goodbye to her son, but to write down the names of the people responsible for taking his father from him. Marcus Brennan, Eddie Doran, the warehouse on Route 6, and Wesley, Sarah read it first. Then Donald. Then I leaned over Donald's shoulder and read every word. Sarah closed the folder carefully when she was done. She looked at Cooper for a long moment. "Cooper," she said, "what your mother left behind matters more than I can explain to you right now. But if we move forward with this, it will not be easy. It will take time. It will require you to speak in places that are difficult and in front of people who will try to make you doubt yourself." Cooper sat with his hands flat on the table. He looked at his father's letters. "What would I have to do?" he asked. Donald leaned forward. "Tell the truth. To us first, then to a grand jury. Then, if the case goes as far as we believe it can, to a courtroom." The word courtroom made Cooper's face go pale. I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to take him to a safer, simpler answer. But it was not my choice to make. So I said the only thing I could say honestly. "It's yours to decide. So, whatever you choose, I'll be standing right beside you." Cooper looked at the photographs on the table. Then, at the watch. Then at the letters in his father's handwriting. "My mother spent 16 years being afraid," he said. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life that way." He looked at Sarah. "I'll testify." What we learned over the following weeks made the blood drain from my hands every time I let myself think about it clearly. The Brennans were not simply a dangerous family with money and a trucking company. They were the kind of organization that federal agencies speak about carefully. In controlled rooms. After checking who was listening, their freight operation had been under investigation for 9 years. 9 years of building a case. Losing witnesses. Watching evidence disappear. And running into walls constructed from other people's fear. The government knew something was happening inside that company. They knew the trucks moved more than the manifests claimed. They knew certain names appeared too frequently in places they should not have been. They knew the warehouse on Route 6 was significant. But knowing and proving are two entirely different countries. And the road between them is paved with witnesses who were afraid to walk it. Until Cooper, a 16-year-old boy who had walked 8 miles through a Vermont winter to reach a payphone, carrying 16 letters and a dead man's watch, became the witness 9 years of federal investigation had been waiting for. What he knew, what his mother had written, what Wesley had put in those letters. It was not everything, but it was the thread that, when pulled, finally started to unravel the rest. The day they told us we had to move, I stood in the kitchen of the house where I had raised my son for the last time and looked at it the way you look at something you know you will never see again. The wall clock that had ticked through 30 years of mornings, the kitchen table where Wesley had turned his coffee mug, Margaret's handwriting on a recipe card still pinned to the refrigerator, the hallway where I had measured Wesley's height every year until he was taller than me. They gave us 2 bags each, personal items only, nothing that could identify us. I left behind Margaret's china. I left behind the books and the baseball trophies and the recipe card and the kitchen table. I kept 1 photograph of Margaret, 1 of Wesley, 1 of the 3 of us at the lake when my son was 17 and did not yet know how things would go. Wesley's watch, my father's shotgun, and the boy, especially the boy. Cooper handled the relocation better than I did, at least on the surface. He did not complain when they changed our names. He did not cry when they explained what we could and could not do, who we could and could not contact, how carefully we had to move through the world for the foreseeable future. But the first night in the new house, I was lying in the dark and I heard him across the hall, barely audible through the wall. He was whispering his mother's name. Just that, over and over, quietly enough that I almost missed it. That was when I understood something nobody had told me about witness protection. It does not simply hide you. It removes the life you lived and hands you a different one. And you are expected to inhabit it while the old one goes on without you. The people who loved you do not know where you are. The streets you knew no longer belong to you. The photographs you left behind gather dust in the house of a stranger. It buries you while you are still breathing. Cooper finished high school under a name that had been assigned to him in a government office. I watched him answer when teachers called someone else. I watched him write that name on papers and test forms and college applications. And I thought about what it costs a young person to live inside a borrowed identity for years. But he kept going. That was the thing about Cooper that I could not stop noticing. Every time I expected the weight to finally crush him, and there were many days when it looked like it might, he would get up the next morning, make himself a bowl of cereal, sit down at the kitchen table, and open a textbook. He talked about engines, about bridges and load distribution and the mathematics of structures. He talked about the things he wanted to build one day, as if building something solid and permanent was the specific antidote he had chosen for a life that had felt impermanent from the beginning. He did not get into Cornell. For a week. He was quiet about it in a way that felt like grief. Then an acceptance arrived from a state university with a strong engineering program. He read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. He was quiet for a long time, just sitting with it in his hands. Then he said, "Mom would have liked this." I said, "Your father would have too." The trial began in November. By then, Cooper had learned how to walk into a courtroom without appearing afraid. I could see the fear. Of course, in the slight tightening of his jaw, in the way his fingers found the edge of his jacket and held on. But he had learned to carry it without displaying it, which is a different skill than not being afraid, and in some ways a harder one. I sat in the back row wearing the same dark suit I had worn to Wesley's funeral. For 2 days, my grandson testified. He spoke about his mother, about the years of moving and hiding and changing names before they could put down roots, about the letters Wesley had written, and the watch, and the money that had arrived before his father died, about the warning delivered at a graveside, about the funeral, the threat, the name Eddie Doran, and the warehouse on Route 6 that Caitlin had written about in the last weeks of her life. The courtroom stayed so quiet during those 2 days that I could hear the scratch of pens against paper from the press gallery. On the second afternoon, near the end of Cooper's testimony, the judge called a brief recess. In the moment before people moved, I looked across the room. Marcus Brennan was sitting at the defense table with white hair and polished shoes and a face like weathered stone. He looked like someone's grandfather, someone's neighbor, someone who coached Little League and sponsored the local firemen's fund and had, for his entire adult life, been quietly feared by men who knew better than to say his name too loudly in the wrong room. For one moment, his eyes moved past Cooper and landed on me. I made myself look back. I would not give him my fear. He had already taken too much of what belonged to my family. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in late November. When the foreman stood and read the first word, guilty, Cooper closed his eyes. He did not cry. He did not move. He just sat very still with his eyes closed and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Marcus Brennan received a sentence he would not outlive. 4 other men received sentences of their own. The trucking company that had moved something worse than freight across state lines for the better part of 2 decades was dismantled. Accounts frozen. Offices searched. Men who had spoken in careful whispers their entire careers found themselves with microphones and cameras and federal agents at their doors. The warehouse on Route 6 was raided. I will not tell you everything they found there. There are things that do not need to be named to be understood. What I will say is that after that day, there was no version of events in which Marcus Brennan was a businessman. There was no story he could tell that held together. He had built an empire on the silence of frightened people, and my grandson's voice brought it down. Cooper turned 18 in January, in a kitchen that was not the one we had started in, with a name that was not the one he had been born with. Life does not clean itself up neatly after justice arrives. The trial closed the case. It did not return his mother. It did not give him the father he had needed, or the childhood that should have been his, or a name he could carry freely. But it gave him the future. He started college that fall, studying mechanical engineering the way he had always planned. The first time I helped him carry boxes into his dorm room, I watched him stand in the doorway for a moment, looking at the narrow bed, the cheap desk, the posters his roommate had already put up without asking. He looked scared. Then he smiled. Not a large smile, Not the kind that erases things. Just a small, careful, real one. The smile of someone deciding, for perhaps the first time, to believe that what comes next might still be his. He calls me every Sunday night. Sometimes we talk about classes. Sometimes about his girlfriend, whose name I keep between us. Sometimes he calls with nothing important to say at all: the food, the weather, the noisy upstairs neighbor, the laundry machine that eats socks. Those are my favorite calls, because for years, every phone call in this story meant fear. Every ring meant something arriving that you did not want to answer. Now every Sunday night the phone rings and my grandson is on the other end, alive and building things. And nothing about that is small. The night before Cooper left for college, we sat on the back porch of the house that was ours only because the government required it to be. It was August, warm and quiet, the kind of evening where crickets fill the dark and make the world feel almost ordinary, even when nothing about your life has been ordinary for a long time. He had his bags packed. 2 duffels, 1 backpack, a box of books. Not much for a boy beginning a future, but more than he had been carrying the night he ran. I told him he could have 1 beer. We sat without talking for a while, which is the best kind of sitting. Then Cooper turned the bottle slowly between his hands and said, "Granddad, can I ask you something?" I said he could ask me anything. He looked out at the dark yard. "That morning," he said, "when I called from the payphone, why did you come?" The question sat between us in the August air. I could have given him a dozen answers that sounded more significant. Family, blood, instinct. The wisdom that old men like to pretend arrives clean and certain. But the truth was smaller and more honest than any of those. Because you said the right word. I told him. He turned toward me. "What word?" "Granddad." He looked at me like he had expected something more complicated. "I know that sounds like nothing," I said. "But if you had called me, sir, or Mr. Aldworth, or anything at all that was more careful and polite, I think some part of me would have decided it was a scam. An old man alone in a dark house at 4 a.m. is a common target. I might have hung up. I looked out at the yard. But when you said Granddad, there was something in your voice underneath the fear. Like you had been carrying that word your whole life and were terrified no one would answer it. Cooper was quiet. He turned the bottle slowly. I had never said it before. He whispered, "Not to anyone. My mom talked about you sometimes. She said you were a good man. But I'd never had anyone to call that." "I know," I said. I knew it when I heard it. We sat with that for a while. The truth is, there was a second reason I drove north that morning, though I did not fully understand it until much later. Somewhere in the part of me where grief lives and waits. I had always known something was wrong with how Wesley died. I had never let myself say it aloud. I had never let the thought become real enough to examine. Black ice was easier. Bad luck was easier. A tragic curve on a frozen road at night was something a man could go on believing. But murder would have meant my son had been afraid and had needed me. And it would have meant that at Christmas dinner, he had tried to tell me he had looked across the table and said he had tried, and I had asked once, and then let the silence win. That was what I could not afford to know for 6 years. That I had been sitting in the same room with the truth and had not pushed hard enough to reach it. So when Cooper called, some part of me heard Wesley calling too. Some part of me recognized that here was the second chance I had not known. I was still owed another frightened person in the dark. Another moment where the question was simply whether I would answer. This time, I answered. Here is the thing I want you to understand before this story ends. The people you love will not always tell you clearly when they are in trouble. Most of the time, they will give you something smaller. A sentence that does not quite fit the moment. A pause that lasts a beat too long. A phone call they almost do not make. A look across a dinner table that says more than they are ready to put into words. And you will be tired. You will tell yourself they are fine. You will tell yourself it is not the right time. That you will ask tomorrow, that surely if it were serious, they would say so clearly. Do not trust that voice. Call your son. Call your daughter. Call the friend who has been quiet. Ask the question again after the first answer. Drive through the snow if you have to. Because sometimes the truth does not come knocking twice. I almost did not answer my phone. I have thought about that more than I want to admit. If I had stayed in the chair, if I had told myself it was a wrong number, if I had been 10 minutes more asleep or 10% more afraid of what I might find, Cooper would have walked back into that storm alone. Maybe the cold would have taken him. Maybe the men looking for him would have found him before sunrise. Maybe his mother's box and everything inside it would have disappeared. And with it the last proof that my son had not died by random bad luck on a frozen road. I would never have known. I would still be sitting in that old kitchen in Stowe right now, watching snow collect against the window, repeating the same story to myself until I died believing it. What I have learned, at 68, is that decency is not a feeling. It is not something you believe about yourself in a warm room. It is something you do when the phone rings at an unreasonable hour and everything in you says let it go. Decency is picking up the phone. It is driving north on unplowed roads because a frightened boy said one word that broke your heart open in the best possible way. It is calling an old student you have not spoken to in years and saying, I need you to believe something that sounds impossible. It is standing beside a 16-year-old in a courtroom while the man who destroyed your son finally hears the word guilty spoken out loud. None of it felt heroic while it was happening. None of it felt like a story. It felt cold and confusing and necessary, the way the right thing usually does. Caitlin Brennan spent 16 years protecting her son with nothing but fear behind her and love in front of her. Wesley died, trying to reach the child he had never been allowed to hold. And a boy named Cooper survived because, at the very last moment, someone was awake to answer. So if there is someone in your life who has gone quiet, call them. If a sentence sounds slightly wrong, ask what it means. If your heart tells you something is off, do not wait for a clearer sign. Ask the second question. Open the door. Go get them. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Would you have answered that phone? Would you have driven north through the snow on nothing more than a voice and a name you had never heard before? Tell me what you would have done. And if you believe that truth has a way of surviving, no matter how many years it takes, and no matter how many people try to bury it, subscribe to Reddit Revenge. Because every week, there is another story where the silence finally breaks. The truth finally arrives. And the people who thought they had gotten away with everything discover they were wrong.